For our first session, I'd like to introduce Janet Napolitano, the president of the University of California, and Dr. Wayne Frederick, the president of Howard University. Thank you both for joining us.
You're welcome.
Okay, thanks for having me.
So both the UC system and Howard, much like colleges across the country, have released their reopening plans. But since those announcements, we've seen kind of a steady rise in COVID cases. So I guess my first question is, what will fall 2020 look like on the UC system and at Howard? And President Napolitano, I'll start with you.
Well, fine. Well, thank you, and thank you for having me. It turns out that reopening a campus is much more complicated than shutting it down as we did last spring. You know, the UC system has 10 campuses spread throughout California, and they're in different environments. We have campuses in a small rural community, Merced, and campuses in large urban areas, the Bay Area, Los Angeles, San Diego. And so we have to evaluate the circumstances of each campus differently in their context. What is the actual virus presence in that area? What is the local health guidance that the campus needs to follow? You know, our overall approach was to develop a sense, a common threshold of safety standards that campuses needed to meet for testing, for tracing, for quarantining, for social distancing, for masking. And then beyond that, and then to build for the fall in terms of the local circumstances. Most of our campuses will be hybrid. They will have some in-person classes and laboratories, and much instruction will remain online. We're still grappling with things like extracurriculars and how to manage those, you know, what to do with the football season. And I think these plans, once issued, are iterative. They're going to be flexible. They're going to need to change and evolve with the changing circumstances. And we're going to need to be very agile and nimble in dealing with those circumstances.
And President Frederick, as President Napolitano mentioned, it's different for each campus. So I guess I would pose the same question to you. What does a fall look like at a 10,000 student campus like Howard?
Yeah, well, we certainly are going to de-densify the campus. We don't anticipate all 10,000 students will be back. We have given students the option to, especially if they have health risk or if they simply just have concerns, that they can have their classes online. So we're planning for a hybrid environment. Howard is unique in that we hire more and employ more African-American faculty than any other single higher ed institution in America. And because of the disproportionate impact of this virus on African-Americans, we have a higher moral obligation, in my opinion, to make sure that we do this safely as well, and to really put that in place. So we are really going to be aggressive about testing, contact tracing, making sure social distancing and those things are taking place. Right now, my cabinet is back to work. We are going into the office every day and just basically running a little bit of a test ourselves in there. We have a hospital on our campus and a medical school and nursing, allied health, as well as social work. So we're going to use those resources as well wisely to also assist in making sure that health and safety comes first. We have places to quarantine. But I want to underscore that the ultimate thing that's going to make this work is personnel responsibility and accountability. And while I think sometimes we're cynical about our young people, I'm not. I'm extremely optimistic about them. They are the most altruistic generation of the 5 or 6 generations that exist today. They don't get enough credit for their altruism. But if you look at every marker that has ever been measured around this issue, they score way higher than the rest of us. And I think that if we place some trust in them and we give them guidelines, they'll step up and perform.
And we heard from some students reasons why they are excited to return to campus. We heard from other students why they were worried about returning to campus. I guess, Dr. Frederick, as a medical professional, you know, as an oncologist, medical researcher, how do you allay some of those fears? How do you, get students, and, well, one, create a safe enough environment, then also convince students that, yes, this is a safe environment to return to?
Yeah, that's a great question. During the pandemic, I've continued to operate, and as you pointed out, I'm a cancer surgeon, and so my patients are at risk. I myself, I'm at risk. I have sickle cell, and I'm a type 1 diabetic. And so the first thing that I've tried to do is to communicate my own experience and to let students know that you can navigate safely if you really adhere to certain guidelines, which include wearing masks in the appropriate settings, washing your hands frequently, social distancing, etc. So the first thing I would say is we have to communicate very, very aggressively about what we're doing. The second thing is we have to involve and engage them in the process. They know what they do, what they like to do, for instance, in residence halls. And we have to be mindful of that. And we have to figure out a way to still get them to have some of those interactions, but to convince them how to do it rather than just suspending all the activity. I think manipulating the activity so that it's safe is the right thing to do. And then the third and last thing that I have been trying to communicate in my messages is about the communal good and making sure that we look at it through every lens. The responsibility that we have as an institution that primarily serves African American students in a country that is in an economic recession with an African American unemployment to where it is, in keeping our full complement employed, again, it is a high bar. So we have to look at how we do that. We keep them safe, getting them out into the workforce to diversify different fields is also a very critical aspect of what we have to continue to do. And I think in the backdrop of the social unrest that we've had, we have to try to wrap all of that for them so that they see it in its completeness.
And President Napolitano, on Monday, Immigration and Customs Enforcement announced that international students would have to leave the country or risk deportation if their universities were to switch to online-only courses. So I guess, has that, and I mean, for both of your campuses, international students make up a large percentage of the population. So I guess, how has that factored into any decision-making? I know that there are lawsuits now that are challenging the guidance, but I guess, how does that play into your decision-making?
Oh, ICE's announcement this week was really quite misguided and devastating. I think it was ICE's attempt to force campuses to reopen as part of, the administration's push to get everybody back to school. But it ignored the significant impact on campuses and our need to be able to adapt our curricula to the health circumstances that we exist in. For a system like the University of California, we have thousands of students from around the world. It's a University of California is a talent magnet from around the world, discouraging international students, which has been happening over the course of the year. It's been more and more difficult to get visas, to get appointments for interviews for visas, and then to have this kind of plopped on us right before the beginning of the academic year, in my view, not only is misguided, but it was done improperly and illegally. And the University of California is considering its own response, and that could include actual litigation as well.
And so I wanted to actually move to one of the more kind of practical matters, and Dr. Frederick alluded to this a little bit earlier. So one of the most pressing questions that people ask me kind of on a pretty frequent basis, and I imagine they ask you all as well, is how do you police student conduct? I know that you were saying that you have to put a lot of faith in students to kind of adhere to some of the social distancing guidelines that you set out, but what happens if a student doesn't do that? We've seen cases where people have violated curfews, people have had large gatherings without regard to some of the guidances that mayors and governors have put into place. So I guess, how do you police student conduct? And President Napolitano, I'll go to you first, and then President Frederick.
Okay, well, I think the first thing is, as Dr. Frederick said, is to involve students in the creation of the conduct expectations, and then to educate and emphasize with students that this is not only about their conduct, but the health of the community in which they exist. It's an opportunity to educate young people about the value of community and the responsibilities that go along with being in a community. I think if there are students who perpetually violate the rules on social distancing and masking, for example, then the normal student conduct approaches need to be made for discipline. But I think we begin with communication and education.
And President Frederick?
Yeah, it's obviously complicated and difficult in trying to make sure that everybody stays within that. With the student leadership, I've spoken about them doing their own self-policing. I think if they step up to the plate and they really engage and interact with their peers directly, I think that's going to be helpful. We've considered everything from having everyone sign a waiver to having people sign a pledge. And I have felt strongly that we need to publish a pledge, but not necessarily have people sign it. I think we have to engage our community in an all-for-one type of attitude. And I think a lot of what has happened over the past 6 months in our country suggests that we could do with a lot more of that at this point in time. And that involves trust, and it also involves a lot of love, a love for self and a love for each other. And I think if we do that and we underscore the humanity that's necessary, I think we can get there.
I think universities can lead by example here and can demonstrate to the community, to the country at large, how you really manage a public health crisis. And how everybody has a role to play. I think this is an area where universities can and should lead.
And so, actually, to that point, there have been a range of decisions that universities have made. Where Hampton University in Virginia has said that all of its classes will be online and it won't have students return. Cal State has said that it'll have online-only classes for the most part. But universities have arrived at different conclusions. And when you have kind of a range of decisions, it lends to a kind of messy messaging that people are receiving on the other side of it. So I guess, how do you address that kind of disparate messaging there?
Yeah, I think you make a good point. And you have to look at your circumstance. So at Harvard, we have about 6 or 7% of our students are international students. And I myself first came to the US as an international student on an F1 visa. And so, what happened yesterday is both personal and I think extremely traumatic for what students may experience. There are lots of reasons for students to be in the country while they get their education, because as I tell most of my students, 20% of what happens for you happens in the classroom, but 80% of your growth happens outside of the classroom with lots of other engagement that you have. And so I think along those same lines, I think each of us has a responsibility to describe the uniqueness of our institutions. And that's one of the things that I've tried to underscore in this process. We have a hospital on our campus. We have a medical school. We have the only dental and pharmacy school in the district. We have a school of social work and a school of nursing and allied health. We have a public health program, which means that we have assets on our campus that suggest that we have at least some advantage in terms of trying to build a system that can work. And I think, as President Napolitano said, we have to lead and demonstrate to the country. And if our universities can't be, I would say, beacons of solutions, and if not solutions, hope, then we're in trouble. And so, yes, I think we certainly have to provide that. And that messaging is going to get messy because we all are different. You mentioned Hampton and their decision, and I don't think you can apply that to every single one, or Cal State to the University of California system. I'm sure President Napolitano probably sees it through that lens as well. We're all very unique, and we have to make sure that that comes through in the messaging.
And so this is a question from Andrew Mount in the question and answer portion. But what happens if you have a surge on campus? Is there a fail-safe? Is there a point where there's kind of a hard out, you switch to an online only if your campus becomes a hotspot?
Yes, that's part of our planning. What would be the trigger for resuming total online as opposed to hybrid? What would we need to see? That's why the ability to do testing and tracing is so important. You want to be able to identify an incipient outbreak before it becomes a major outbreak. So yes, we are all have plans for if we would have to go to a shutdown. And that really affects not only instruction, but the occupancy of the dorms, because you could have students coming back, although they'll probably be in singles, not doubles or triples. But for students living in the dorms, you could have kind of a boomerang impact, and we need to kind of set the stage and make sure that students are prepared to be flexible.
Yeah, I think it's important for us to have that contingency plan. What I'm hoping though is that we would have robust enough plans that either prevent or contain such a situation, because we are getting to a point in the country where there has to be some acceptance that this is with us, and we have to figure out a way in terms of how to contain it and control it as best as possible. And I think as we make the decision to bring people on campus, everything from de-densifying to having spaces where we can quarantine students, how to contact trace and follow them, is all part of that mitigation. I think one critical part of our plan is to try to keep everyone who is high risk off the campus. You just simply don't want those people to get infected. And I think if we start with that as a baseline, and we limit the exposure and manage that risk, I think that could put us on a road to success.